Welcome back to Democracy Docket's 2024 Candidate Q&A interview series. I'm Courtney Cohn, and today I'm speaking with Jennifer McCormick, the Democratic candidate for governor of Indiana. Welcome, Jennifer McCormick, to Democracy Docket. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, so first I just want to start by asking, why are you running for governor of Indiana?
In 2016, I was elected the state superintendent of public instruction. And so I spent 4 years at our state house and learned an awful lot. But what I saw there was not a focus on Hoosiers. I saw a focus on a political party. And so for me, it's about Hoosiers deserve better. And that's what I intend to bring them, better than what we have now.
Right. And in 2021, after you finished serving as the Indiana superintendent, you changed your party affiliation from Republican to Democrat. Can you talk about why you decided to make that switch?
Yeah, for me, it was about values. So I watched a party, the Republican Party, that was really unrecognizable. I had always been committed to serving, being a public servant, and making sure that we were staying focused on the needs of Hoosiers. I'm very concerned about what's happening with reproductive freedoms and education and our economy. And so for me, it was just staying true to values and switching party to align with the Democrats who share a lot of my values.
Right. And kind of going off of that, talking about your values specifically, I know that one of the issues you mentioned on your website is protecting democracy and voting rights. So, how do you plan to protect democracy in Indiana and in the country in general as governor?
Yeah, it certainly is a problem here. We are 50 out of 50th in voter turnout. And so we have a registration problem, but we also have a turnout problem. And our General Assembly continues to make it harder, which you would think, would be counterproductive, but they're trying to accomplish the voter suppression in order to win. So for us, we know if we vote that the Democrats will win in Indiana. So making sure that we're using our agencies, making sure that we're using our board appointments, and making sure that we're using our commissions in order to address civics education, but also to celebrate our voting rights and make sure that we are doing everything year round in our diligence to make sure people are exercising their rights to vote.
And to go further into that, the issue of civic education. So I know that you have a past as a teacher for many years, and obviously the state superintendent. So can you talk about why improving and increasing civic education is important, especially for improving young voter turnout specifically?
Yeah, it's huge. Voting is our democracy. It's the foundation of our voice. And so for me, I was a teacher, as you mentioned. I was also a local school superintendent for 7.5 years before becoming the last elected state superintendent of Indiana. So I am well aware that the vote is our voice and that impacts everything we do at the local, state, and federal level. So, that is their chance at speaking into democracy to protect their rights and their freedoms and change things when they feel like they need to be changed.
And to shift gears to college voters as well, right? Because those are also young voters. Recently, Purdue University, which I saw actually you went for your undergrad degree, has
Mhm.
been in the news recently because the Tippecanoe County Board of Elections decided not to hold Election Day voting site on campus for the first time in decades. So, can you talk about how that impacts college voters and people who are maybe voting for the first time?
Yeah, I don't think it's without coincidence that, I am a Purdue undergrad. And so boiler up. But I also know, too, for this is the first time in decades where there wasn't availability to vote on campus. And, being a Big Ten campus and knowing the importance of that electorate, I mean, it's just, it's one more example of voter suppression. And, when I was on campus not too long ago and in the city of West Lafayette, there were a lot of citizens and students and faculty that were saying, this is ridiculous. And although they tried to fight it, they couldn't get it resolved. And so, it's just one more way in which they make it very, very difficult to access, their right to vote. And so for me, it's unfortunate, it's frustrating, and shame on Purdue.
Certainly, this is definitely a much larger issue, as you mentioned, of, people, especially like Republicans and different kind of officials, making it harder for people to vote. And another example of this is actually this past week, so recent, Indiana officials asked the federal government to verify the citizenship of over, this large number, over 500,000 voters, including overseas voters, people who registered without an ID. Um, they're asking them, hey, can you verify their citizenship, right? So what are your thoughts on this push to eliminate non-citizen voting and spread this narrative about this happening on such a large scale?
Yeah, and we're a few weeks out, right? So if it were a huge issue, this would have been looked into months, if not years ago. And so it's one more example of they're panicked because the Republicans know that we're right in this race. We're statistically tied. Our attorney general candidate for the Democrats looks really good. And so people are coming up, not just Democrats, but also Republicans and independents. And so when you have the urgency and the energy meeting together and things are happening in Indiana, their response to that is voter suppression. And so that is just one more example of them trying to make it harder. And it's a fear tactic, right? So they're making sure people are afraid that if they go vote and they do something wrong, there will be consequences. And so we are trying to get out the message and just being aggressive with our get out the vote. But it's clearly an attempt just to scare people to stay home.
And speaking of this kind of idea of, just spreading this narrative, right, that, scares voters or kind of cast doubt on the election, your Republican opponent, Mike Braun, said on his website that election security is one of his top priorities and that, people must trust that our elections are free from fraud. So what do you make of his assertion that, oh, we do need to be worrying about fraud in elections and that this is a major issue?
Yeah, well, he was one of the few U.S. senators who supported Trump when former President Trump was out very vocal about the election was stolen. And, Senator Braun was right there. And so, we know where his allegiance lies with the rhetoric. And again, to me, that's just one more example of when there's no proof to it and you know it, but yet you're messaging it. It's just an attempt to mislead and create fear and chaos. And instead of celebrating the vote and celebrating what our democracy is based upon, I mean, he's trying to suppress it. And so that goes right back to if you can't win, on a straight up and down with the vote, then you try everything you can to suppress it. And that's exactly what they do.
And voter suppression is a large issue across the board, in all these different ways, and it's being spread in all these different ways. And I noticed that on your website, you talked about a few ways to kind of combat that, expanding voter registration access, increasing ballot access, and fighting against gerrymandering and different tactics that are used like that. So can you kind of go into those issues a little bit more and how you plan to tackle them if, elected governor?
Yeah, gerrymandering is a huge issue in Indiana, as it is in other states. And so when you have a one-party rule, you get what we have. And they're ridiculous. I mean, some of our districts are drawn in such a way that it's not even recognizable, it's comical. And what goes along with that is that whole attitude of what's the point? If they're gerrymandered so badly, then you have Hoosiers are like, what's the point of voting? It won't matter because it's decided. And we have to educate voters as well on it, particularly like statewide, that it doesn't matter about gerrymandering per se, because it's a statewide race and every vote counts. And so we have to remind people of that, but it goes back to civics education. But it also goes back to, we have to break that supermajority and we have to have balance at the state house. That includes getting some House positions, but also getting the governor's office. It'd be great to get the attorney general's office to break some of these gerrymandering. But it also, we have 3 judges up. And the judges play into this huge. And so informing Hoosiers of what's happening and who are the players that could make change is incredibly important. So we will continue to do that. And once we get elected, we will continue to do whatever is possible to work with our local level officials and our school systems in order to make sure that Hoosiers are better informed.
So, based on what you just discussed, do you think that these local races need to be discussed more?
Absolutely. I mean, it goes down to that local level is incredibly important. And we have just too many Hoosiers who are sitting it out, whether it's local, whether it's a, municipal year or if it's a presidential year in the local, state and federal level. I mean, we have in Indiana, it's just a huge concern. So it goes back to making sure we are educating Hoosiers, making sure that we're using that platform in a way that people are informed, but also too, they are armed with what they need to be armed with in order to make smart decisions and go out and vote.
In terms of, getting people out to vote and kind of spreading that effort, how do you think that, you can increase voter registration and how do you make that more accessible for people who may not be able to access it?
Yeah, so voter registration for this election, and that deadline has passed. So now our charge is getting out the vote. I mean, that's every piece of every ounce of what we're doing right now is informing voters, getting our name recognition, getting our message out as far as reproductive freedoms, access to healthcare, education, good paying jobs. But it also is about making sure that they are aware that they can early vote and make sure that they are aware that, what those hours look like, where's the website to find that information. So we are making a lot of calls. We're knocking on a lot of doors. We're sending a lot of postcards. And, we're working with the other candidates who are on the down ballots in order to make this happen. Also, Vice President Harris has offices that are opened here in Indiana, and they are working really hard as well to get out the vote. So, there are a lot of different efforts coming in different angles in order to make sure that we can capture every single vote we can.
Yes, I mean, get out the vote efforts are incredibly important in any election, especially one as
Mhm.
contentious as this one. And, something that I'd like to go back to that you talked to earlier was this need to kind of combat this divisiveness. And again, Indiana is known as a mostly Republican state. The Republicans have a majority in both houses of the legislature. So, how do you seek to foster bipartisanship in an environment like this?
That's one great thing about my lieutenant governor. I mean, he was in the General Assembly for 20 years. And so he has relationships with many people, Republicans and Democrats, and making sure that he can reach across that aisle and get things done. And he would also preside over the Senate, which is incredibly important here in Indiana. And so there are a lot of different ways we can do that in the day to day during legislative session. But outside of session, making sure that we're still being a good partner in our boards and our agencies and our commissions on how whether it's they're elected or whether they're appointed or whether they're hired, making sure that we are getting the best of the best that represent Indiana. And that is, Republicans and Democrats. But that's part of this to make sure you have a lot of different ideologies at the table, but to kind of find those common ground areas that we can come up with solutions. So, there are a lot of different ways to do it. We feel confident. When I was state superintendent, we did it. We were known as the Ellis Island of the State House because our doors were open to all, and we helped everybody who needed help with education policy. And we will continue to operate in that same method.
I'd like to dive deeper into what you said about how your experience as state superintendent will help you as governor. So, how does holding like a statewide office like that prepare you for an executive role like this?
Well, it's huge. I was one of seven statewide, and I was in the executive branch. And obviously, Indiana has taken that position away. So it's not separately elected at this point. But I learned a lot about how the state house works. I also learned a lot about the areas in which it really doesn't work well. And so learning those lessons and utilizing them to make better and move forward in a positive direction is very beneficial. I also got to meet a lot of people, partner with a lot of agencies and companies and business and industry. And, that local level is huge. And so that relationship building started then and will continue. So there are so many benefits that already being at the state house. Initially, when I got in, and I tell people I was pretty naive because it was just not at all. I was thinking this bipartisan approach, like I did as a local superintendent, and we just do things to get things done, and we're fiscally responsible, and we are all striving for excellence, and that's not at all what I saw at the state house. So now that I've learned how it works, the good and the bad and the ugly, I will bring those lessons in order to move forward. So it helps on day one being able to hit the ground and go from there.
And is there any specific legislation that you are thinking of in terms of your agenda, in terms of passing, like you were saying, on day one, or in the following days in terms of voting rights and democracy, or other issues as well?
Yeah, well, we'll certainly use our platform for reproductive freedoms, which is a huge concern here in Indiana. My opponents are extreme and they want to take that even further. So making sure they never get near that state house in that position is our goal, right? So to fight and push against extremism. So reproductive freedoms, access to affordable health care, but also too, there's a lot of conversations about K-12. We're hearing that it's going to be a tough biennium for fiscal. And so, making sure that what gets prioritized gets funded. And we've not been great at that in Indiana. We have a lot of infrastructure needs that also need to be addressed, but also the passage of cannabis, which about 80% of Hoosiers are with me on this, and we have a plan and we're ready to go.
Yes, and speaking of initiatives, like, for example, marijuana or other issues that could potentially be handled through ballot initiatives, I noticed on your website that you mentioned that pushing policy through ballot initiatives is really important, especially, again, this is a very important democratic tool. So can you talk about how ballot initiatives can help, push your agenda or make people's voices heard?
Yeah, and it's so frustrating that it's 2024 and Indiana still does not have that as an option, and a lot of states do, and it's because Indiana knows if you put, abortion on the ballot, you put cannabis on the ballot, you put driver IDs on the ballot, different items on the ballot, that the majority of Hoosiers will speak positively about those items and make sure that women have their reproductive freedoms, and make sure we would have cannabis legalized, and make sure that people who need a mechanism to get to work safely can get there. And so they know that that would be the result. And this is just one more way to suppress our voice beyond just voting. It's this is, not having a ballot initiative is one more way to carve out the majority of Hoosiers and our desires.
And what do you specifically, you mentioned this a little bit before, but what do you specifically think the benefits would be of being able to have citizen-initiated constitutional amendments or measures going forward?
Well, we've seen it in other states where it energizes people to be back involved in the civic process. It allows us to have one more path and avenue into how we live our lives. There's a lot of benefits to it, but we have to have someone in that office with a platform in the governor's office in order to push that issue. And I intend to do that. But there are so many benefits, from saving lives to changing lives, but also re-engaging Hoosiers. That would be an incredible benefit to doing so.
Yes, ballot, and there are many democracy related. We're at Democracy Docket. We're tracking the many
Mhm.
democracy related, voting rights related, and also, there are other issues as well. But those kind of ballot initiatives in so many states have them. So it is interesting to talk about how things happening in other states could apply to Indiana, and the benefits that could come from that.
We keep our eye on Ohio, our neighbor, because they've been having a lot of ballot initiatives and have passed them successfully. Kansas is very similar to Indiana, so we pay attention to Kansas. And actually, Governor Kelly's on her way to Indiana. But we pay attention to other states that are pretty red but can get it done. And I know we can get it done. We just have to change the leadership in order to champion to get that initiative passed.
Now, this whole conversation about voting rights and democracy is so incredibly important, but I like to end my interviews kind of on a fun note so voters can get to know you as a person. So I saw you recently at a campaign fundraiser concert called Musicians for McCormick. So I wanted to ask you, who are your favorite Indiana musicians, and then just musical artists in general?
Well, by far, John Cougar Mellencamp, which is now John Mellencamp. So I'm aging myself. I mean, he is obviously from Indiana, and I grew up listening to him, and he's always been one of my favorite artists. And those songs hit home because they are so Indiana-ish. And so it was the fundraiser was a lot of fun. There were a lot of local artists who played, and some were members of the symphony, and some, were just up and coming singers. And so we had a great time. We had a great response and a good little audience, and so made some money, which is always good in a campaign. But the arts are incredibly important, and I'm glad you bring it up, because in Indiana we're tending to go the other way, and I just a firm believer that creativity, and just for the quality of our life and the quality of place, that we got to preserve our art. So yeah, it was a lot of fun.
Glad to hear it. And yeah, that's interesting. We're also talking about arts as well. We're really running the gamut here. So appreciate
Yeah,
it.
there you go.
Yes. All right. Well, Jennifer McCormick, thank you so much for joining us today at Democracy Doc.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to today's 2024 Candidate Q&A interview. As the election gets closer, it's incredibly important to continue to hear from candidates. If you want to stay informed on democracy and voting rights news, subscribe to our free newsletters now. See you next time.